Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises to Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Bahashim, Rachak Wadash. Double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. Peace and blessings to elect of Israel. I'm the brother Micah Allah from Great Millstone Raleigh, coming to you through the spirit and power of Yahweh, being the true name of the Heavenly Father. Bahashim, meaning in the name of Yahweh Shai, being the true name of the Omegon Son, whom the world ignorantly calls Jesus Christ. Quick lesson, those words edifying in transit. Just going to flow through the spirit. Just had some, thoughts in the mind and wanted to, of course, bring it out. And again, those words edifying. But the title is going to be, the deceitful heart. All right, the deceitful heart, and really going to that war within. It's good to say we wrestle not against flesh and blood. A lot of things that we fight against is our own mind. Our doubts. Our unseasoned thoughts. Our foolish and vain thinking sometimes that gets us in trouble, man. And again, going to the title lesson, what sparked me to get into the lesson, of course, is you go into Jeremiah 17th chapter, in the 9th verse. The heart, being the mind, is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. When you're desperate, you're gonna do anything you can, and the mind is gonna do everything it can to be wicked, ultimately against the ways of Yahweh Bahashim Yahweh Shai, tying into this flesh. All right, and you go into the excuses people make. They'll blame other people, they'll blame demons, they'll blame their enemies, they'll blame the system, they'll blame curses, which indeed, that is a thing, but they rarely ever confront themselves, with that same energy, that they have to everything that's outside of them, which, again, it is true, we can only control what we can control. We really can't control much of anything. That's why it's always "Thus saith the Lord" or Lord's will. But it's going to talk about examining yourself. And when you examine yourself, it has to be according to the will of Yahweh Bahashim Yahweh Shai. Not by your own counsel. All right, which counseling yourself isn't bad. But if you're not measuring that counsel to the ways of Yahweh Bahashim Yahweh Shai, then it's not counsel at all, man. But in the multitude of counselors, there is safety. And our counselor ultimately, is the word. But you have men that have been, through certain experiences in this faith, and been through stuff and exercised in certain things that they can give better advice, especially to younger brothers. But again, going to the point of the lesson, a lot of times you get yourself in trouble, man, because you lean upon your own understanding. Read Proverbs 14th chapter. How was it 12th verse? There is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. You might feel like you're right. You might have no doubt in your mind that you're right, and still be dead wrong. And that's how the case is for the majority of people upon earth. And really, I go into our people, I say, most of them are willingly ignorant. Not to give them a free pass, but they are in their mind. They think they're right, man. That goes into Proverbs the 1st chapter. They don't want to be reproved. They don't want to take heed to counsel, because they got this holier than thou mentality that they're not doing no wrong. And that's why they can't be reproved. That's why they're gonna stay on that wide and broad gate till they be destroyed, man. Because they'll confuse confidence with foolishness, man. There's nothing wrong with being confident, but confident means to have faith in the Lord. Con with fidence, man. It goes into with faith, man. But that confidence has to have discernment. So to say, my people have a zeal, but not according to knowledge. That fiery passion that you have for the Lord. Well, if it's not tamed, it's not, seasoned with salt, then, you're going to find yourself making dumb mistakes, unnecessary mistakes. And a lot of times, if there's a repeat offense, you find your way out the truth, man. You know, because what does the heart do? The heart justifies sin. You know, the heart justifies sin, and the heart justifying sin. How could you, ever be in the spirit of the Lord, man? If you're always leaning upon your mind and you're going into your flesh. Okay. That's why we pray to the Lord. Was that Psalm 51st chapter? King David, create in me a clean heart, O power, and renew a right spirit within me. Because without this truth, your spirit is filthy, man. Because why? Because you haven't been washed with the word. So again, going into that Psalm 51st chapter, that cleansing is that divine work the Lord does with us, which doesn't really come from so-called human effort. The Lord, because His mercies failed not, that's why we're not consumed. So we're right in the eyes of Yahweh Basham because He justifies us, and what we're doing, He says, it's good, it's clean. Goes into our reasonable sacrifice, Romans 12th chapter. But again, you go into a dirty heart, read Psalm 14 chapter, a person that said there's no God, there's no power, all they do is pour out filth, and abominations. All right, anybody that so-called say they don't believe in a higher power, in most cases they're not right, man. And they make dirty decisions, and they do it without the fear of Yahweh B'Hashem Yahushai. Because even Yahushai talked about it. That's Matthew 15th chapter. What pours out of the heart? Evil thoughts, murders, adulteries. Because sin starts with a thought, and then it plays out in action in real life, man. Especially something that's you're always meditating on. You're gonna give life to it, man. You're gonna breathe life into it. That's why again it's important, to make sure that you're doing what's right in the sight of the Lord, okay, and not just in the sight of men. Even the mouth, okay, things you speak, your conversation. If you're always talking about worldly stuff, what's gonna happen? You're gonna become worldly, man. And they're gonna want to listen to worldly people, and then now you're back with the drunken, talking about worldly nonsense, man. So that's pretty much it, man. I think James the first chapter is another one. All right, every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust. You can't say it's and entice, saying, "Oh, the Lord calls me to go off. This is the Lord's doing," or whatever. Or it's Satan. Or it's A, B, C. No, man. Most of the times it's you, man. And speaking from experience. You got to be real with yourself, man. You have these issues that you're not conquering, and that's why you're losing that battle, man. Falling into the same mistakes, going into or trying to get into certain relationships with females, and this shit just don't gel, don't work. Because why? Because the stuff you're involved in, being in this truth, it just don't work, man. And the scary part is, you go into those, what King David said about secret faults. Sometimes you're doing stuff wrong, and you don't know you're doing wrong because you're not around the light. You're not around like-minded men. Whole time you're springing out, an unfruitful vine, and it's just growing and growing, man, because it's not being corrected until it gets chopped off, and then you wonder what the hell happened, man. But again, going to when really going back to James 1st chapter, lust when it's conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and what is the wage of sin is death, man. You got your eye on this woman, and she got a man, and you're gonna try to after work hours, you've been thinking about it for a whole week, then eventually you do it, man. Because the heart, meaning the mind, man, it's desperately wicked. That's why you have to train it. You have to train your mind. Okay, going into stoicism and taking on hardships and delayed gratification, exercising patience, faith. Putting in some work in the gym. Going for a walk, whatever it may be, man. So that extra energy of the flesh, is exerted, man, because it goes into idleness. You find yourself when you say you get sent home early, or you got some more time you didn't expect to have. What do you do with that time? Most of the time, again, speaking from experience, you BS, man. You stuck scrolling on the phone, looking at dumb shit to buy or whatever, man. Fantasizing. That's why we just talk about blessed is he that readeth. But I'm thinking about in the Apocrypha, giving your mind over to the law of the Lord. Sirach 39th chapter. In the meditation thereof, you have to be occupied in prophecy, man. Because if you're not occupied in prophecy, your mind's not occupied in something, it's gonna occupy in folly. Okay? And madness. All right? And that's why, again, the Lord puts us through trials, because, when everything's hunky-dory, there's nothing being tested or proven, So that fire, when we go through certain things, is to reveal your heart, man. To see where your head's at. The Lord talked about us having a strong constitution, okay? The trial of a man is in his reasoning, going to the Apocrypha, So, don't ramble on too much. Another one is Proverbs, the 4th chapter. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Because if you don't, you're going to have, to deal with issues of death, man. You have to have that discipline of those, those over those lusts, man. Keep it under your body, okay? Because, again, the heart is going to justify itself, the mind. Yeah, I can do that shit, slippery slope, man. That's a slippery slope, Not to say, you don't make decisions and just sit in the corner, but make sure, again, what you're doing is not going to get you in trouble and bite you in the end, man. That's how you deal in this life period, man. Because we have a job to do, of course, but while we're here, you have to be useful. The best ability is availability. But if you got all these precepts and all this knowledge, but you find yourself tied up behind bills, and you can't do videos because your phone service is out, or you being a wild one, after camp hours, and you driving around drunk as hell, man. You're getting pulled over and getting hemmed up, whatever. Now how you gonna get to camp? Because again, it's just a little drink. Oh, it's just a little this, a little that. That's how men fall away, man, little and little. Yeah, we know who our enemy is, man. We know we're in a land that's not ours, a people of strange customs and tongue. But a lot of times it's the stuff that we deal with, yes, there are happenstances, but it's because of our own, stupidity, man. Just being real. Not saying just because if you do fix the stuff, your life's going to be perfect, but it will be simpler. Simpler is always usually better. So keep it simple. Trusting Yahweh Shai. If you're not sure about certain things, get counsel. Don't overthink certain things too. You're at the grocery store, you don't know if you should get, coconut water or whatever, man. Just get your stuff and get out. But more so, again, the point of, you're not conquering your own deception, your own BS, your own lies, that flesh, that old man, that's within you that you haven't figured out yet, man. You want to rule over people, but you can't rule over your own self and your own thoughts. You're undisciplined. Every time you see a woman, you got to look at her ass. Just because. That's not manly, man. And just giving examples. Again, we're all guilty, but hey, man, we're here to get better. This is the perfection of the saints. All right, be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. It's not, that we're going to be perfect. It's a striving. And when you're striving, you're in a certain spirit. Because you're testing yourself, you're proving yourself, and you're getting better, man, at your craft. This is our profession, man. We're holy men, We got our folly and stuff that we do, hobbies, whatever. But don't let that take over the main thing, which is, again, to please Yahweh Shai and push His word. So that's it, man. Lord's was edifying. I want to give all praises to Yahweh Shai, Double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. Peace and blessing to the elective Israel. Shalom.